Hello and welcome to my talk. Thank you very much for attending this keynote online. As Christian has said, my name is Lennart Nacke and I'm very happy to be here. I'm a little sad that I couldn't make it all the way to Magdeburg, but nevertheless I made it here virtually and we have the chance to enjoy this keynote talk together. I hope I will provide some information that is useful to you, and feel free to ask me any questions later in the Zoom conference. Now, as Christian has said, I am an associate professor for human-computer interaction and games at the University of Waterloo, where I work at the Stratford School of Interaction Design and Business, as well as the Department of Communication Arts. I'm quite excited today to give this talk about the loot box of gameful user experience. Now, loot box of gameful user experience, that's going to be an interesting definition to unpack. And don't be afraid, we're not using loot box in the negative sense of something that helps monetize certain aspects of a game, but more in the sense of something that fosters curiosity so that we have a better idea of what makes a game engaging and exciting. Okay, so that being said, what's my background? Now, Christian already said a little bit about, he's been in Magdeburg before, and that is actually correct. I have been at the University of Magdeburg as an undergraduate and a master's student, and I was quite excited to have my early academic career there. Back then I was still kind of struggling to understand technology, but happily eventually I figured it out and I decided to pursue a PhD. Now, to do that, I ended up moving to Sweden, where I had the pleasure to work with some excellent people in the field, and eventually I had to defend my PhD thesis. This is a picture of me angrily trying to hold my ground against Georgios Giannakakis, who is an expert in the field of effective computing. It was quite an exciting and very long defense, and eventually I managed to get it done and ended up becoming one of the first PhDs in game development, at least in the Swedish program that I was in. Now, with that exciting background, I was still kind of new to the area of human-computer interaction in games. I had a lot of experience in game design, and I was trying to start to understand what user experience for games means. Now, the interesting thing was, how would I put this into action when I actually try to understand what interaction and user experience evaluation and design meant together? Okay, so I took the route to University of Saskatchewan in Canada, and this is interesting because, as you know from our other keynote, Petra, she also ended up going to Canada after being in Magdeburg. So it's interesting how our paths kind of didn't cross, but we both ended up in the same continent, even though in very different locations, although Saskatchewan is also kind of in the middle of Canada. But eventually I moved on and I got hired as an associate professor at the University of Magdeburg, where I am now. Now here I am actually running something that is called the HCI Games Group. This is my research group. We work at the Games Institute, and this is a picture of a couple of years ago when I had a lot of visitors, and we work with a lot of international visitors on problems related to human-computer interaction in games. Now, one of the biggest challenges there is, how do we manage to understand this new field as we're trying to create it at the same time? Now, to have a better understanding of that and get an overall better understanding of what it means to do human-computer interaction, we then, of course, looked into the different areas of user motivation and user engagement. Now, of course, we're interested in key aspects of interaction, but to me, there's something really exciting about understanding what makes users tick and why would users want to click on an app, or how can you even accompany users in their journey of learning a new application. Is there anything that we can learn from games that can make it more exciting for us to engage with a regular application? This seems to be kind of like the holy grail for user experience designers as they're building applications that are supposed to drive engagement and foster some sort of user interaction. Now, this is not always easy. However, we try to do it anyways. Now, the important thing to understand here is that when we're talking about loot boxes, we're really talking about the things that are kind of exciting and rewarding and not really something that players have actually seen before. So loot box is always a little bit of uncertainty of what's in there, and it's usually something exciting, and it's not necessarily something that people that are new to the game completely understand. However, somebody that has already achieved mastery and has worked with the game or played the game quite a long time would be excited about a loot box. A good example here is from the game Destiny. Now, this is a loot box that gives you a specific type of armor. Now, the way that the game Destiny is structured is it is built around several concepts of getting higher grade weapons and higher grade armor and customization of this armor and these weapon types. Now, the interesting thing here is how can we take some of these ideas of providing something new and exciting for players and for non-players so that we can make non-game applications exciting with this concept of loot box, with avoiding what I would call the box of issues, right? Like all of these problems of monetizations and players just feeling kind of sucked into this. So sort of a well-being kind of application instead of a more difficult, oh, I have to do it application. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, how do we end up with that? What are we already good at? Well, as a UX designer, as you know, I don't really have to tell you this, we design things which are easy and fun to use. Would you agree on that? I would say definitely a lot of UX designers would agree that at least easy is a core tenet of what we're designing for, but also fun to use has gotten more and more important as we're talking more about user experience instead of just usability. But as designers, as you know, we are also problem solvers. Now, what does that mean, problem solvers? It means we're trying to overcome an impediment that is given to us by an application. Often that impediment is a lack of engagement or a lack of interaction, a lack of an activity that we're supposed to be doing with the application. And this is kind of where usability, user experience, and game design meet, because we're trying to make that interaction more joyful and more engaging for people. So we want to understand and represent the people for whom we're designing. This is a core tenet of user experience design, but is also more and more important for people wanting to design video games. The question then becomes, what is the secret sauce of video games? Well, as you might already imagine, some of the ideas behind the secret sauce of video games are that we're building games on really kind of the same structure as we've built board games and other types of games for years. We have at the heart of it a bunch of rules, and these are restrictions. So anyone knowing a little bit about games will tell you very fast about something called the magic circle. Basically an agreement of players to say, we are going to agree that these rules apply to us, and we're going to abide by them, which is going to make it more exciting. Now, the interesting thing then is, what are those rules? Well, obviously, some of the things that we have in place, and we call those rules in video games, often we call them mechanics. And one of the core things is that we find quite often are challenges. So things that help keep people interested by testing their knowledge or allowing them to apply their knowledge or some sort of skill and helping them understand the skill. We also have a mechanic called learning new skills. We have the opportunity for people to go on quests. We have something called levels and progression and certificates. And there's many, many more of these. These are just a couple of examples. Of course, some of them are more about social aspects, collecting, trading, building a stronger meaning, building a purpose, caretaking, or even allowing access to special functionality. Now, this is where loot boxes come in again. Quite interesting. Now, think about it. What else do you find very exciting about games? Is there something in there where you would say, this is actually something where I would say, man, this game has gotten to me. Well, here's an example of a video game that does this really, really well. Now, this game is called I would love to show you a wonderful as we've shown the game. Now, another game is here, and this is, I think, Clash of Clans, and the idea again is as you go through the game, you're trying to get different ideas of what's happening in the game, and you get rewarded for completing different matches. So you get these loot boxes again, which then have some random rewards, something that brings you joy, but also helps you complete the game better, helps you level up, increase your skills, and you're progressing through the game. A very exciting concept if you think about it. Now, these concepts, of course, work as well in other areas that are non-games. So where have we seen those? Well, here are some examples. These are the areas where some people have applied the concept of game design more specifically to areas that are non-games. Now, these areas, as you can see, we got a lot of tracking apps. The space of quantified self got really excited about some of this progress tracking. There's a lot of health apps, a lot of fitness apps that are making good use of some of this tracking technology. And of course, these aren't the only ones. Now, we've also seen this permeate into other areas. Now, this is interesting because who of you would say that Snapchat is actually an application that helps you achieve something? It's not. It's not a productivity application. But these applications that are just there to bring us joy and engage us in some sort of mundane activity are becoming more popular. Snapchat and Instagram, or even Facebook, all of these apps, while their tracking may be debatable, do provide some form of joy, social connection, and some form of self-expression to the people that are engaging with them. Now, Snapchat, of course, which is my example here, has taken this a little bit further, because Snapchat is just all about the customization of the face. Anyone that's ever used it knows that you can make rainbows happen. You can, depending on the season or the location, apply several weird transformations to your face, apply virtual makeup, and even play little games with your friends as you're engaging in the app. Now, this is way beyond a regular user experience. This is something very heavily and deeply gamified. Now, along those lines, we've kind of thought about, okay, so what if we were to personalize gamification? Now, gamification, of course, being this idea of applying gameful tactics to things that are non-games. Now, here you can see an application where we try to automatically evaluate something called the Hexad player types. Now, this is a type testing that we developed together with a colleague from Gamified UK, Andrea Machewski. And we've developed a questionnaire in the past that helped us find ways to personalize, according to these Hexad player types that you see here, gamified or gameful experiences. Now, with this new application, we're now actually able to, with some degree anyways, allow us to determine the player types just by letting people play a game. This is a very interesting development in that field, as we're trying to really build more personalized applications and more personalized gameful applications. The trick really is finding out what engages different people, because everyone works a little differently. Now, at the heart of it is understanding how we build for skill building. Skill building is a core concept that permeates games. If you think about it, a lot of people in education are really excited about game development. And they're also very excited about how we can use games for learning. We are employing games to actually learn new skills, gain new understandings. This is really kind of a cool idea if you think about it. And it is something that has been around for as long as games have been around. Now, your users have to learn your systems every time you're building a new system. So your users' needs and goals change over time, because as people keep using their application, the same as if they were playing a game, they become better at it. And so users become better at working with your application. So you really have to know the journey of the user and design with that user journey in mind. Now, I'll touch on user journeys in a second, but user journeys might not be new to you. So really, it is something that is kind of core to building user experiences. You want to understand how users go through building this experience and becoming a person that is, quite engaged with that app that you're building. So how do they become experts even? This is a core question you have to ask yourself. I have a user, I'm onboarding the user, but how do I turn that user into sort of a long-time person? And again, I'm using the term user all the time, but I know that, we should talk about people and a person and somebody that is actually engaging with this application. Okay, so, but this, again, for lack of a better word, user, how does that user transform from a newcomer to a regular to finally become an enthusiast, somebody that advocates for your application? Well, you kind of have to think about building a core learning loop as a simple version of the regular user experience that you're creating. How do you do that? Well, first let's revisit user journeys. So user journeys, some of you might be familiar with them, work in games too. User journeys are all about, well, you could almost say a story, a narrative. Now, if we look at these little examples, they really follow the same idea as a narrative in a traditional medium. You have an exposition, you have a rising action, there's a crisis, a climax, then a denouement, and an end. So this is sort of a classic drama structure. Now, how does that work in games or in regular applications even? Well, as you can see in the background here, it starts with the current state, then you have some sort of problem, trigger, or call to action that your application has to provide. And you clearly outline the steps that the person needs to take. But as the person is taking those steps, they run into impediments. Eventually, they'll have to solve a problem. And then what? The goals are being met. So the person has to kind of understand what the goals are as they're engaging with the application. Usually during the discovery process, they're kind of getting an idea of why they're in for this app. But you really have to teach them what they're going to do as they're engaging with the app. Of course, this can be done by doing story mapping exercises and other things. And again, this is very much where game designers and user experience designers can overlap. We're all about creating these engaging stories for the player. The story is not just the story in the game and something as exciting as the narrative that we're playing through, but the story is also the journey that we're undertaking, the experience that we're building. To me, experiences and stories are heavily interconnected. A good experience can be driven by a really, really good story. And it's quite exciting to see how we go from one to the other. Now, how does it work for the player's journey? Well, this is a concept that was made popular by Amy Jo Kim. The idea behind it being that we have 4 steps of the player's journey. We start with discovery, we go to onboarding, we then have this habit building loop that I'll talk about a little bit more in detail later. And then we go to the final concept of mastery. Now, going from this initial aha moment of, oh, I've discovered something new, towards mastery, that is really the key to good player experience design. Okay, so let's walk through each of these steps with an example. And you can already see some of the examples here. Now, some of it being as simple as Waffles, the little corgi from Amazon. I don't know if you've met him before, but the idea being sometimes you go on a wrong part of the website and then Waffles shows up and says, well, that wasn't here. Do you want to search for this? Kind of making you discover more parts of the website and putting you back to where you go. Now this is, if we're using Stephen Anderson's terminology from seductive interaction design, this is also a delighter. So a delighter is something that you're experiencing in a game or in a use case scenario where you haven't quite seen that coming. So you feel like you're being delighted, you're being surprised by it. And that element of surprise is quite powerful in interaction design. So thinking about how we can design for these powerful, surprising, and informative moments is key to building a good discovery here. Now, another example is, of course, Dropbox, a very popular app that uses the idea of gamification quite widely. And with Dropbox, what you can see is as Dropbox downloads, it had that little animation. Now they've overhauled their design recently, so not all of that is there anymore. We have elements of Dropbox Paper here. We have elements of Slack. Now Slack is really good at onboarding, so I'll use some of those examples as I go through there. I've got an image of Scene. This is a Scene card. This is a rewards card for Canadian movie theaters. And they also have an interesting sort of habit building loop where they're trying to engage you in mini games and trying to get you to come back to play more and then find out more about movies and then, of course, spend more money as you go to the movies. Quite exciting. Now, there's also the idea of getting to mastery. And again, in my Slack example, you can see how that works, and I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so let's get started with the first one, which is discovery. Okay, discovery means I need to set the stage for the visitors or people that haven't used my service or product or website, and you show your value proposition. Now this is, you could tie this into marketing or other areas like that. But the idea essentially being, I have something new and I want to explore that. It can be as simple as going to the Dropbox website, downloading Dropbox and then just seeing that little animation, or it can be as exciting as going to a game website and seeing what's currently up in season, as what we're seeing here. The game is Fortnite, and what we can see here is Nexus War. It's the current season, so it's quite exciting to see. Okay, yeah, Nexus War. I want to be part of that season. I want to, invest in that. But do you know what's actually going on? Not necessarily, but it's something that pulls me in, something that gives me a moment of excitement. Okay, so what's next? Obviously, the next step is onboarding. How do I onboard people into my game designs? It can be something as interesting as building, sort of a customized wardrobe in The Sims, or it can be something as straightforward as most games actually do. And this is Cut the Rope. This is a little mobile game here to the bottom right, where it just says, okay, you got to cut the rope and you got to feed the little monster. Okay, easy enough. I got to do swipe actions on my tablet or phone, and it's quite clear what I need to do. It's really helping newcomers that are coming to the product to understand the product, learn, and see what the value of the product is. Slack does that really well. Again, Slack being sort of my walkthrough example here. When you download Slack and you start, they have a little welcome. They show you the different areas of Slack, but they're also really helping you break down what you need to know. So you can ask Slack about these little questions. It's quite interesting how you play around with a little AI, you could call it, to get to know the application. There's a lot of discovery involved in that onboarding process still as well. Now the next big step is, of course, habit building. That's where you're trying to get the hook or the core loop in your application so that the user keeps coming back. You want to have a pleasurable, repeatable activity. And we'll talk about that a bit more in detail after I finish the 4 steps. But really think about what's the repeatable, pleasurable activity that will pull people back. It can be little delighters, as Slack's doing it with the little tips. It can be something such as being able to customize emojis and other things, as Slack's doing it. You can see 2 applications here that we've been working on. One is a pharmacy information app, which you can see on the left there. And the other one was an application that we built for a bank. And so what we can see there is a little bit of feedback about the finances of a person, helping them to understand that better and hopefully pulling them back in. Quite exciting. Okay, so habit building is sort of the core. Like you really want to drill down the habit building to make this a regular thing for people to come back to your application. But then mastery, the final step. In games, that's what we call the elder game or the late game. Yeah, only your best customers experience this, and it really builds full customization and community. this is interesting. If you think about Reddit or Stack Exchange, there are a lot of websites that have that too, community-driven websites, essentially allowing people to give them special roles access, helping them curate certain things on the website, really trying to make these things more catering towards those elder users. And of course, this is also where the loot boxes come back in. If you're asking what a loot box is good for, other than the monetization aspects that everyone's frowning upon, well, the interesting thing about loot boxes is they keep the game interesting for people in the elder game. They want new content. Not all the time, but new content can really pull people back into the game and make the game more exciting for them. All right, cool. So those are the 4 steps that we need to build skill building loops and skill building stories, journeys for players as they're going into the game. Now we want to inspect a little bit closer that habit building loop, because that is really, really key. So in the habit building loop in games, we're essentially looking at cues and triggers that are then leading to repeatable, pleasurable activity, which leads to skill building feedback, which leads to progress and investment. So this is the loop that's happening there. It's really key to look how that actually works. So cues and triggers means you want to have internal, situational, external, and engaged cues and triggers. So really think about what is the internal trigger that leads a person to do something is really quite key to building these things. Next, what is a repeatable, pleasurable activity? So what is triggered by the emotions of a player? What is their internal urge or need? And we know this from user experience design already, because in user experience design, we try to do need finding at the start. So we try to build for that need. Of course, you do that to an even greater degree when you're building games. In games, we call this a core mechanic. Why core mechanic? Because it's what the game is built around. It's something as simple as being able to manipulate physics, as you do in Half-Life 2. Very exciting things, very simple things usually, can be as simple as just cutting the rope and then seeing how the physics act. Or if we go back to our Peggle example, let me just play that clip again because it was so exciting. Here we go. Now in this Peggle example, again, just fantastic how it finishes. But really what we're doing in the game is that at random hits a load. This is of course the last being by hitting it, even though we always quite exciting. Alright, we've seen that enough. So now the question becomes, how do we make an activity pleasurable? So repeatable, pleasurable activity is all about this core loop, finding that core loop, finding something that's exciting, but then also rewarding people for that activity. So the feedback, the skill building feedback helps players improve. So it's not something that's exciting for them to look at, but it's also something that's constructive and helps them build a better ability based on what they're experiencing there. Feedback loops really help people get better at that core activity, and this is key to becoming better and more engaged in the game. So finally, we've got progress and investment. We show progress and investment paths and allow users to customize, build, and collect here. Okay, so that's it. Really, if we can build this habit building loop in games and we can integrate it in this player journey, going from discovery, onboarding, to this habit building, to the mastery, we've got ourselves a pretty interesting game or gameful application if we want to apply this outside of games. Really quite cool how game design can go from just being used for games towards being used in other applications. Now finally, I want to talk a little bit about evaluating game design, because there have been ways that we've evaluated game design. All of that has changed a little bit recently, obviously, because of COVID. I mean, you're seeing this right now. I'm in a computer. I'm trying to look at the camera. Can't always really find the camera. Always looking slightly next to the camera. There's a lot of things that are a little bit different as we're working with all of these online technologies. All right. But let's try and understand what we're actually evaluating first. So what are the core tenets of player experience? I've written a couple of papers about this, and this is from a very early paper that's published in the Journal of Entertainment Computing. But here I broke down player experience in these different layers. First we have the gaming experience, then we got the player experience, we got the gameplay experience, and we got playability at the core of it. So really, the gaming experience or the user experience in games is kind of incorporating all of these factors. So we've got context, and this is sort of the biggest thing, because a lot of people talk about game systems at the start, which was just, yeah, okay, we know usability is kind of important for a game, I get it. But then we're looking at the usability in terms of the interaction with the player. Now for that, we have to understand the characteristics and the internal influences of the player. This is where a lot of my research about player personalities came from, because I wanted to understand what's going on in the player. How can we understand the motivations of the players? And then we go to the interpretation of that. So what are the factors that are actually building that player? And this is where context comes in. Context really is key. So really looking at these external influences, temporal, spatial, social, and cultural, is key to understanding the overall player experience. What's a good way of evaluating that? Well, I've looked at lots of different ways over the years. This was sort of an initial classification. You got quantitative, qualitative, objective, subjective measures. And then you're trying to cluster a lot of these classic human-computer interaction or interaction design measures in there. And you come up with sort of this sketch. Okay, a lot of these work really well when you're in person, and that's fantastic, because the way that they work is they're integrated in this whole design loop of game designer working on the game then exchanging information with the player and the user researcher just working on understanding the player. This is also a bit weird because as a games user researcher, we're not kind of testing the game. We're testing how the players are interacting with the game. So it's sort of a second order design problem because we're just getting the data from the users, we're giving it to the game designer. The game designer builds the game, but they don't build the users and the players. They don't build the interaction with the game. They just build the game. So we always need to have that games user research so that we can make sure that we're doing the right kind of interactions. And this is sort of key motivator for a lot of my research, to look into understanding, okay, what does it mean to be a user researcher and inform the game designer? And again, you can check my publications. I didn't want to include a lot of that in the talk today, but there's a lot there if you're really interested in that field. Now, some of my earlier work was very much on this kind of stuff. So this is sort of experimenting with physiological measures. Did a lot of studies with that, came up with a lot of different tools in that space. And I think, there's a lot of data in there, but over time it turned out that it's very exciting, but there's also a lot of risks, specifically as we're going into, virtual reality. New big thing, doing a lot of studies. It's really hard these days to do virtual reality studies because you can't do in-person studies. At least in Canada, we're still restricted from doing a lot of that. So it becomes much harder, but the headset's already there to do this kind of thing. And now we have to think about how can we do that whole stuff remotely? Well, a lot of the traditional protocols still work when doing remote research. And to be honest, some of the things that I found work best are the ones that I want to at least talk about quickly. Now, there's a lot of other options out there, but these are the ones that I recently tried and have actually worked out for me. So one of the things that we've had quite a significant amount of success with was Look Back. This is sort of a tool that allows you to do video observations remotely. So you create a link, it can be like a Unity game or anything that's web-based. You send that link to the user clicks on the link, and you observe them, and you can do live annotations as you're going through that video data. But then also, after the fact, you can invite people from your team to do even more annotations. Really quick way to get feedback, really quick way to get insights. The only downside for me as a sort of a researcher that has, the push from, I don't just need to get insights, but I actually need to get papers. So to get a paper, maybe at some points it needs to be a little bit more rigorous. So then we put our sites onto Dovetail. This is an interesting analysis software. I gotta say, I've really been enjoying working with it over the last little bit. And it's something that helps you do thematic analysis. Now, the idea behind thematic analysis being you create a lot of qualitative data. This is more and more common as we're engaging in this whole remote procedure. We're doing a lot more interviews, right? So we're not just doing these observations and taking little notes. but we're also getting people to think aloud. That doesn't always work out super awesome, but I mean, those of you that have done Think Aloud know how it is in a lab, and it's sometimes even a little bit harder if you're getting people to do that from home. The other thing is you want to conduct a good interview right after you've done the user testing session. Now, specifically with games, this kind of retrospective is not always the best, because one of the really good advantages of physiological testing is that you're testing right there at the moment when something occurs. Now, with sort of this retrospective qualitative feedback, you don't have that. However, we found, at least in a lot of our initial tests, there was a lot of overlap between what people said qualitatively and what we found in the physiological measures. So I actually don't mind working a lot more with physiological measures. And then, as you're doing this thematic tagging, you can quickly see what kind of topics and themes bubble to the foreground. As you can see, there's sort of a nice little quantitative breakdown even as you're going and tagging each of these text bits. And really the interesting thing about this online technology now is it actually even allows you to do automated transcripts. And this is kind of where I think AI has come in quite handy, because back in the day we did a lot of manual transcribing, or we used third-party services. But now the automatic transcribing has actually become quite solid and useful for us. So we've done more and more of that. And I must say it's actually quite helpful, specifically if you're doing more qualitative work. So that's sort of the interesting developments that we've done recently. But let's not forget that there is still a lot to be said for some of these interesting physiological methodologies. But I do want to remind you that you always have to think about this loop. This is how the information flows. You're not designing, you're user researching. As a user experience designer for games, I don't even know if they exist yet. That's kind of a very new field. But you kind of have to have two minds. Sometimes I would put my user researcher hat on and really look at the player. And sometimes I put my designer hat on, and then I really have to work on the game. It's very hard to combine these two. So some really excellent people are needed for that field of user experience design in games. And I hope I've given you a little bit of an outline and a little bit of an idea of where this all is headed in this keynote today. So I want to thank you very much for your attention. I want to leave you with some of my contact details here. I hope you keep in touch. I hope you have some time to reach out in the chat that's coming. If you can, please connect with me on Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn, most of these platforms. You can also see if you can add me to a gaming platform. I'm usually academic on most of these platforms. And that is because that was sort of my handle. Eventually it ended up being a student club in Magdeburg, which is still active. So kudos and shout out to academics. And if you want to send me an email, you can find my email address there. And I also have my internet addresses there. And I'd be very pleased to be talking to you about some of this stuff, and specifically to get your insights on how it feels for you to be sometimes a designer for user experience and engaging game designs, and sometimes a user experience researcher that is very much interested in evaluating these types of games. I hope you enjoyed my talk. I want to leave you with this title, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.